In my last video, I said that I'm not able to can with this Star Wars Fate of the Old Republic game thing. And how I hate myself because my mind is just going all kinds of places, looking into the future, what might happen, how the game will look like, all kinds of things. Well, soon after I made that video, I remembered I actually wrote a 20-something page piece on what I want to see in Knights of the Old Republic 3. And I wouldn't be lying when I say it happened long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Well, now we have Fate of the Old Republic, or KOTOR, so might as well share my ideas. Best thing about this is all these things that I wrote can easily be applied to KOTOR. Yes, it's not KOTOR 3, but it kinda is. Same, but different, but still the same. So, given what I already said, it's pretty evident what this video is going to be all about. To be clear, this is mostly going to be about gameplay features. In terms of story, I'm not going to say a thing. I did write stuff about that, but given the situation, it's pretty much pointless. Besides, even if the story is great, but the gameplay is bad, it's still gonna suck. And I want the game to be an amazing experience. So I think our boy Casey Hudson and his team can deliver on this particular front. Besides, I'm not that great of a story person, so there's that. I might make an effort, but yeah, it's not really needed. As far as graphics go, I mean, come on. Making this game ugly is pretty impossible. I'm pretty sure everything will look amazing, from the smallest detail to the biggest object you can possibly imagine. I would be very much surprised in this day and age that someone can make a game that is not up to the standard in terms of graphical fidelity. One disclaimer before I actually start talking about these things. I could talk forever about this, and this video would probably be double the length or even more, but it might not be the best thing ever to do. It's really long as is. So what I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to point out stuff that I believe have the major impact on the gameplay based on what the issues with KOTOR games were. Sure, I might miss certain things, but that's what the comment section is all about. I actually can't wait to see what people might write down if this video ever blows up. If not, well, there is always a second video that can go more in depth based on what I have said here, or just to correct myself. There is going to be several sections of this video because I will go pedal to the metal, which means it's going to be a long one. I will put timestamps so you can navigate easily through it. Also, do be so kind and like the video if you find it to be good, share it if you want other people to see it, and maybe subscribe to the channel if the stuff I'm making is vibing with you. So, without further ado, let me share with you what I would like to see in Star Wars Fate of the Old Republic. I would argue combat is one of the most important aspects of any RPG. It will make or break the game if it's not executed properly. That's something you will be doing for the most of the game, and if it feels off for whatever reason, it's going to sour the whole experience. You might consider Star Wars Jedi Survivor as one of those games if we are looking at the game specifically from Star Wars franchise. Outside of Star Wars, Vampire comes to mind. So, the goal is not to turn it into Jedi Academy. It's to make player decisions, positioning and stats matter, as well as timing. And right from the start, let's tackle what is for me, by far, the most complicated but also the most important thing to execute properly in any Star Wars game that has a Force user as a main protagonist. Lightsaber combat and lightsaber behavior. I want to see a realistic lightsaber behavior in KOTOR. Lightsaber, one of the most powerful weapons in the Star Wars universe, as well as the most recognizable one, for one reason or the other, is always being turned into a baseball bat. I'm sorry, but that is simply unacceptable. That weapon can cut almost through anything, but in the most games, It's just a glorified lightstick. The only games that managed to do it properly were the ones in the Star Wars Jedi Knight series. Yes, Fallen Order and Survivor had glimpses of proper Star Wars realism, but it wasn't even close what you could experience in the Jedi Knight series. Now, some of you might say, but dude, KOTOR games had baseball lightsabers. And yes, that's true, and it sucked. I am first to admit that. The whole system was built on D20 dice rolls, and even though that was the meta back in the day when you were making RPGs, there was still a clear dissonance between what you could see in the movies and how it was executed in-game. The saving grace with these games, at least mid to end game, was the fact that you could still obliterate enemies in one shot. For those of you who don't know, in KOTOR 2, there was a feat called Flurry, or rather there is still a feat called Flurry. So Flurry would give you one extra attack, but also at master level, you wouldn't suffer any penalties from using it. Combine it with master 4 speed, you are seeing 4 damage numbers, even 5 when I was using it, which would then melt all the enemies like there is no tomorrow. Still, that was an elegant solution because it took you time to get there. The whole point here is that unless you can dodge the attack, parry it, or block it, direct hit from the lightsaber should immediately incapacitate you if, let's say, you get hit on your arm or a leg, or if we are talking about unblocked vertical or horizontal strikes on the torso, for example, it should result in instant death. So, what can be done about this particular problem? Well, first step is to figure out how the combat will look like, or rather, what system are we looking at? I would say that active pause combat that is present in both KOTOR games is the way to go for several reasons. Reason number 1. You cannot have meaningful combat with a lightsaber if you're going to treat it as a baseball bat. Let's say you go full Mass Effect style combat. If you swing your lightsaber around, it becomes trivial to kill anything provided lightsaber functions like it should. Also, Mass Effect style combat, especially in Mass Effect 3, is very much fast-paced. This is not what KOTOR should be, since previous games were never about going fast all over the place. Same thing would apply if you would turn it into, let's say, Jedi Academy. Jedi Academy is not RPG, and that's the only argument that matters. Reason number 2. Like I said, this is RPG with party members. Party-based RPGs need real-time combat system with pause. KOTOR games were never about reflexes. It was about role-playing decisions. You didn't win fights because you clicked faster, you won because you built your character well, you won because you chose the right companions, and you won because you prepared correctly. If you change the combat, you're no longer making a KOTOR spiritual successor. You're just making another Star Wars action RPG. Reason number 3. Players who want cinematic saber combat and reflex-based gameplay already have games like Star Wars Jedi Survivor. KOTOR occupies a different niche. It's a thinking RPG where who you are matters more than how fast you click. And finally, reason number 4. The system can be modernized without being replaced. Keeping KOTOR combat doesn't mean keeping its flaws. You can improve AI, feedback, animations, lightsaber forms. You can make RNG more transparent so players are more informed what's happening. When you enter the combat, you plan, you pause it, then you execute it, and then after that you live with the consequences. This is the core loop that should remain, because that's the soul of KOTOR combat. To conclude, Fate of the Old Republic should not ask, how does combat feel moment to moment? It should ask, what does combat say about who your character is? KOTOR-style combat answers that question. Action combat does not. Now, it's pretty evident that combat should be real-time with pause. At least that's what I'm arguing. But we still have issues with lightsabers being baseball bats. I already outlined why this type of combat system should be the way to go. But what about lightsabers? Well, I believe I might have an answer to it. See, in KOTOR games, there is this thing called personal shield. Problem is, they were just a temporary damage reduction tools which wouldn't last very long. It's all about health pools and dodge chances, which were the main mechanics how to reduce the damage. Maybe you would have an occasional block, something along those lines. But what if these personal shields were more durable? This is what I propose. Every character will have a personal energy shield. The main function of this type of shield will be to act as a secondary health bar. Once the shield reaches 0, the character will have the opportunity to instantly kill his target. That way you are adding more realism to the game without sacrificing RPG elements. The shield can either have a set number of points, or it can be rechargeable. Set number of points would be reserved for low tier enemies, while let's say bosses and mini-bosses would have a shield that recharges during combat. Obviously, after some time you would nullify the recharging aspects of it, but it would extend combat and give it more meaning. We can even go further with bosses and mini-bosses and give them armor made of Beskar or Cortosis. Also, if the enemy is skilled in melee combat, they can use something like electrostaffs or powered melee weapons. As far as other lightsaber and force user go, or any melee wielding individual, for whatever reason, they might not want to use energy shield, or any type of, armors with special alloys. Here, we can add stamina bar. This will correspond to their combat prowess. The higher stamina they have, the more capable of blocking, parrying, and dodging attacks they will be. Also, the higher the stamina bar, the more difficult the boss can be. Add force powers to the setup, and they can be a very formidable and deadly opponents. Not to mention, they could use implants to boost stamina regeneration and all that good stuff. Like the knights in the medieval era being armored and all that when they were dueling, it was all about who tires first. That's pretty much what I want, or rather what I have in mind. One thing I should point out is that there would be a chance to insta-kill enemies even if their stamina isn't fully depleted. Let's say, once you get to a certain stamina threshold, like 50% and below, your chance to insta-kill an enemy via a counterattack, for example, would greatly increase, particularly if you are speccing into that kind of thing. Just imagine a final boss of the game with energy shield, huge stamina pool, armor made of Beskar, and on top of that, really freaking good lightsaber prowess and force mastery. That would really be an epic encounter. So, as I have demonstrated, there are ways to keep the realism of lightsaber as a weapon without sacrificing RPG elements. It's all about adding secondary health bars in one way or the other, but making it lore and logic friendly. Now, this is just one way of doing it, and there may be other ways. To me, as long as the main objective is fulfilled, that being not making lightsaber a glorified baseball bat, I'm satisfied. Maybe there is a better way of doing it, but this is what I came up with. The whole point of this is to keep people talking about this, and then we can have all kinds of cool suggestions. Post in the comments if you have a better idea or something along the lines. I'm looking forward to read them. Right, now let's talk about combat in general. Since I have already pointed out why real-time combat with active pause is the way to go, let's analyze combat in KOTOR games in order to figure out what needs to be improved in this sense. The way I see it, KOTOR combat problems come from several factors: poor feedback, over-automation, and weak tactical expression. By poor feedback, I don't mean whether the combat systems are deep or complex, but how well the game communicates what's actually happening to the player during a fight. KOTOR games perform a large number of calculations behind the scenes, yet they do very little to visually or audibly explain the outcome of these calculations. As a result, combat often feels confusing or random, even when it technically isn't. A common example of this issue is hit detection. When the player attacks an enemy, the animation plays out the same way regardless of whether the attack was a clean hit, a partial hit, a block, or a complete miss. There is little to no visual distinction between these outcomes, and the game rarely makes it clear why an enemy took no damage or why an attack failed. Because the player cannot see the difference, they are left guessing whether the problem lies in their stats, their abilities, or sheer bad luck. Force powers suffer from the same lack of clarity. When a power like force push or force stasis is used, the result is often inconsistent from the player's perspective. Sometimes enemies are affected, sometimes they resist the effect entirely, and sometimes the effect appears to partially work. The game doesn't clearly communicate whether the resistance is due to enemy attributes, force immunity, saving throws, or active buffs. The system knows the answer, but the player does not, which creates a disconnect between action and understanding. Now you might say, KOTOR games technically include a combat log, but it does little to solve this problem. The log is text-heavy and completely disconnected from the action on the screen. Most players either ignore it or fail to link the information in the log to the animations they are seeing in real time. And because of this, the combat log rarely functions as a learning tool and instead becomes background noise. I mean, when I started playing the game, I wasn't even aware this was a thing. Only lately, after my, third playthrough or something like that, I figured out there is such a thing like combat log, but like I said, it's so disconnected from action on the screen, I couldn't tell when certain activity was happening or not, and I just completely abandoned it. Another issue is the mismatch between animation and outcomes. Combat animations are often dramatic and weighty, but their results are governed entirely by hidden dice rolls. This leads to situations where a powerful-looking strike does no damage, or a minor-looking attack deals a significant blow. When what you see doesn't align with what the game calculates, the sense of impact and control is lost. Ultimately, poor feedback prevents players from learning and improving. When the game doesn't clearly explain why an action succeeded or failed, players cannot adjust their strategy in a meaningful way. Combat then becomes an exercise in queuing abilities and hoping for a favorable number rather than a system driven by informed decisions. This is why KOTOR's combat often feels unsatisfying. Not because it lacks depth, but because it hides that depth from the player. So, what to do to fix this? The first step is to make combat outcome legible. Every action should clearly communicate whether it succeeded, failed, or partially worked, and obviously why. This can be achieved through stronger visual and audio cues tied directly to combat calculations. Clean hits, blocked strikes, resisted force powers, and glancing blows all look and sound distinct. Subtle changes in enemy animations, stagger intensity, saber deflections, and sound effects would immediately inform the player of the result without requiring them to read a combat log. The underlying dice rolls can remain, but they should be translated into readable, intuitive feedback that aligns with what the player sees on the screen. At the same time, the game should explain failure as clearly as success. When an attack misses or force power is resisted, the player should receive immediate, concise information about the cause. This could take the long form of floating indicators, brief UI text, or contextual icons that reference enemy defenses, resistances, or activity buffs. By connecting player action to visible consequences, combat stops feeling arbitrary and starts feeling teachable. Then the player learns what works, what doesn't, and they adapt. Another issue with KOTOR's combat is over-automation. While the game presents itself as a real-time with pause RPG, much of the combat effectively plays itself once an encounter begins. After the player cues abilities or attacks, characters execute actions automatically with minimal need for further input. This reduces the player's role during combat to initial setup rather than ongoing decision-making, which makes fights feel passive and detached. This over-automation is especially noticeable in basic attacks and movements. Characters automatically close distance, choose targets, and repeat attack patterns without meaningful player intervention. Once a combat round starts, the player has little influence over positioning, timing, or spacing, even though these elements would logically matter in lightsaber combat. As a result, the player is often watching combat unfold rather than actively engaging with it. Companion behavior further reinforces this problem. Party members frequently make decisions on their own, such as switching targets, for example, using abilities ineffectively, or charging into danger. While the player can pause and issue commands, the underlying systems still encourage automation over control. This creates a situation where micromanagement feels tedious, but letting the AI act freely often leads to poor outcomes. The player is stuck between too much effort and too little influence. Force powers also contribute to over-automation. Many abilities function as simple as press button apply effect tool with little situational nuance. And once a powerful combination is discovered, like force wave for example, combat often devolves into repeating the same action in every encounter. The system doesn't consistently demand adaptation, timing, or situational awareness, which flattens combat variety and makes encounters feel interchangeable. Like I mentioned before, when I unlocked Force Wave, I was just spamming that thing to no end, and the whole room of enemies just dies by being pushed back against the wall. It's pretty silly, but works really good. Because so much of combat is automated, player skill has limited expression. Success is determined primarily by character build, level, and equipment rather than by moment-to-moment decisions. This creates the impression that combat outcomes are inevitable once the numbers are set, undermining tension and reducing engagement. When players feel that their active input doesn't meaningfully change the outcome, combat loses its sense of agency. In the end, over-automation turns combat into a background process rather than a gameplay focus. Instead of feeling like a Jedi making tactical decisions in the heat of battle, the player feels like a spectator managing cooldowns and statistics from a distance. This is particularly damaging in a Star Wars game where lightsaber combat is expected to feel personal, dangerous, and responsive. KOTOR combat doesn't fail because it automates too little, it fails because it automates too much of what should be under the player's control. To address this over-automation issue, the player's role during combat needs to be expanded beyond initial command queuing. Characters should not simply execute repeated actions indefinitely without meaningful intervention. This could be limited by simple cooldowns on certain abilities. Also, introducing light active inputs such as timed reactions, situational interrupts, or conditional ability triggers would definitely keep combat engaging without turning it into an action game. The goal is not constant micromanagement, but consistent decision-making. The player should be encouraged to pause, reassess, and then respond to fight as it evolves, rather than watching the outcomes unfold passively. Companion behavior should also be reframed around intent rather than autonomy. Instead of companions making opaque decisions on their own, players could assign clear tactical roles or stances that define how companions behave in combat. These roles would govern targeting priorities, positioning preferences, and ability usage, which would then reduce frustration while preserving the flow of combat. This ensures that automation supports player strategy instead of replacing it. Weak tactical expression is another problem in KOTOR's combat. While the game offers a wide range of abilities, weapons, and character builds, it rarely gives the player meaningful opportunities to apply these tools in different tactical ways. Many encounters play out similarly regardless of enemy type, environment, or party composition, which then limits how much the player's decisions actually matter during a fight. One reason for this is the lack of meaningful battlefield dynamics. Positioning, elevation, cover, and attack direction have little impact on combat outcomes despite being visually present in the environment. Whether the player attacks from the front, the side, or the rear often makes no practical difference, because the battlefield itself does not meaningfully influence combat. Players are discouraged from thinking spatially or tactically and instead focus on raw damage output. Enemy design also contributes to this issue. Most enemies are functionally similar in how they are fought, differing primarily in health pools and damage values rather than behavior or tactical role. As a result, the same strategies tend to work across most encounters, if not all. And once a player finds an effective combination of abilities or force powers, there is little incentive to experiment or adapt, since the game rarely challenges those choices in new or interesting ways. The system's reliance on statistics over situational decision-making further weakens tactical expression. Character builds and equipment choices are far more important than moment-to-moment decisions made during combat. This means that success is often determined before the fight even begins, rather than through clever play during the encounter. Tactical choices made in real time rarely outweigh the underlying numbers driving the system. Lightsaber forms are a clear example of unrealized tactical potential. While they are presented as distinct styles, most function as a passive stat modifier rather than active tactical option. Switching forms during combat can somewhat influence combat situation, but they are mostly viewed as background mechanics instead of expressive tools. What could have been a system that encourages adaptation to different enemy types instead becomes another layer of invisible math. Because tactical expression is weak, combat lacks identity and tension. The player is not encouraged to think creatively, react dynamically, or solve combat encounters in different ways. Instead, fights become predictable and repetitive, driven by optimization rather than strategy. This is especially noticeable in a game as thematically rich as KOTOR 2, where the philosophical weight of Jedi combat is undermined by a system that offers limited room for meaningful tactical choice. Weak tactical expression can be mended by making the battlefield an enemy design matter. Positioning, facing, and engagement range should have real mechanical consequences. Attacking from behind, controlling choke points, or disrupting enemy formations should meaningfully affect outcomes. Enemies in turn should be designed with distinct tactical behaviors that demand different responses, forcing the player to adapt rather than repeat the same strategy. Combat encounters should pose questions, not just absorb damage. Finally, systems like lightsaber forms and force powers should be transformed from passive modifiers into active tactical tools. Switching forms should change how a character approaches combat, influencing defense, mobility, counters, or control rather than simply adjusting numbers. Force powers should emphasize battlefield manipulation and tempo control instead of raw damage. When these systems actively alter how combat unfolds, player choice becomes expressive rather than abstract. In conclusion, taken together what I have said, these changes would transform combat from a largely automated numbers exercise into readable, reactive, and tactically expressive system. The game would still be driven by RPG statistics and character builds, but moment-to-moment decisions would matter. Combat would no longer feel like something that happens in the background, but like an integral part of the player's role as a Force user navigating a hostile and morally complex galaxy. Right, now that I have showcased issues with KOTOR combat, as well as pointed out how to fix it, at least in my mind, let's go a bit deeper. Normally, if you can read between the lines, you can pretty much understand what I'm talking about. But since I have the luxury to go even deeper, I most certainly will. Remember, there are timestamps, so feel free to navigate at your own discretion. KOTOR games are fairly static when it comes to combat. That's pretty obvious. As a melee character, you are basically locked with another melee character and you smack each other until one of you dies, and then you go to the other enemy and do the same. Thing is, you are a melee character, so disengaging is never a problem since you are fighting in melee range and you never ever change weapons to a ranged weapon in order to fight someone who is far away from you. That's what you have force powers for. On the other hand, ranged characters are kinda screwed. They just stand there in the middle of the firefight like statues and shoot their blasters. That's about it. The only reason you would have a ranged companion is because they are very well written, like for example Karth or Aten. But the thing is, I would always try to make them a melee character, either by fully converting them to a melee role or make them a Jedi, which is basically kinda the same. Long story short, ranged characters were useless because they weren't acting like a ranged character since, again, combat movement wasn't that fleshed out. So, what do I want to see in KOTOR in this sense? Well, here are a couple of suggestions. Ranged characters should try finding cover and actively using it by throwing grenades from cover, shooting behind the cover, and remaining behind the cover if they are under heavy fire. Ranged characters, especially companions, should have special abilities to counter melee attackers. For example, if a melee enemy manages to get close enough, ranged characters should do the following to incapacitate the assailant. Use smoke bombs, electric dart, paralyzing darts, anything that might stun or incapacitate a melee assailant. If the character is able to switch to melee weapon, it should be noted this action should be an exception and not the rule. We want to make ranged characters interesting and not just a nuisance. I mean, when was the last time when you saw Han Solo switching to a vibroblade, for example, instead of using his blaster? Next, characters should be able to scale obstacles while sprinting with minimum loss of momentum. If the character is behind low obstacle or cover, they should be able to vault over the said obstacle. Ranged characters should try to find a way to flank enemies. If your ranged character has a jetpack, for example, something like Jango Fett, they can fly to a high ground and snipe people from above. Coincidentally, if your ranged character is heavily armored and has the means to withstand blows and stuff like that, all cool, but it should be noted it would be nice if the character is using something like a minigun where nobody can easily close the distance. I mean, heavy troopers are a thing in Star Wars, so there is that. In KOTOR, Canderous Ordo comes to mind to fulfill this particular role. My point is that combat movement will add lots of fluidity that KOTOR games don't have and will make combat more interesting. Also, having a Jedi character as a frontliner helps a lot, drawing fire from everyone, serving as some sort of a tank. That doesn't mean other characters shouldn't be able to take care of themselves, but apparently that's the situation in KOTOR. Best thing they can do is just stand in one spot and keep dodging the attacks. Let's say we have a setup where you as a Force user are leaping towards to a bunch of guys. Normally, that should immediately focus the attention to the Jedi, so the ranged companions will have more breathing room, but if you get ambushed, you lose the element of surprise, and that's why ranged characters need mechanics to fend for themselves in these every man for himself situation. Obviously, I could go on, but the main point here is this. Combat movement should be fluid and should incorporate environment and verticality in order to make it more interesting. In KOTOR 2, we have seen the introduction of lightsaber combat forms. I would like to see this system expanded into an important gameplay feature. As you know, there are 7 of these forms. Each form will have its own talent tree in which the player can put points in order to develop their chosen form even further to the point where you will become the master of that particular form. However, being a master in a chosen form will not give you godlike powers since every form has its weaknesses. Okay, maybe close to godlike, but you know what I mean. Because of that, you will be able to choose another form, not as a main form, but as a secondary form, from which you can use the elements in order to improve your main form by reducing the weakness that the form already has. That doesn't mean having 2 masteries, but rather picking some aspects of your secondary form in order to compensate for the weaknesses of the main one. You can simply focus on only one form if you so desire, or you can have primary and secondary form. It's really up to you. For example, say you want to specialize in Soresu. That means even more blaster deflection, stamina regeneration or stamina conversion upon blocking and parrying, more blocks and more deflects. Eventually, when you master it, it will give you the ability to riposte and counterattack. Now, because Soresu is a defensive form, you might want to invest into secondary form, for example Ataru, to get more offensive capabilities. It wouldn't be peak Ataru, but you would gain some elements of it. Some forms might be available immediately, while others can be unlocked via a quest or something like that. For example, one form that might be available in this fashion is Form 7. If we categorize it as an advanced form, then you would have to do some kind of a quest or interact with a holocron or whatever, and then both light side users and dark side users will get the versions of the respective form. So for example, while using Form 7, the user will be able to gain dark side points faster than usual because of the form's nature. Juyo might be used as a more dark side orientated variation, while Wapad can be used as a light side version. That doesn't mean Wapad won't generate dark side points. It will, but not as intense as Juyo. I think it's a neat mechanic, but you can understand where I'm going with this. Also, you might decide that you want to master some other form, and that's completely fine. Remember, Obi-Wan Kenobi did the same by switching from Ataru and going to Soresu. This can be only done once, so you might experiment a bit for the first time, but the second time you decide to switch, that would be that. Force powers are part of combat, no two ways about it. In both KOTOR games, force powers are meant to represent mastery, but in practice they often turn into dominant, repeatable solutions. Abilities like Force Wave, Force Storm, and Force Kill are powerful, have wide area of effect, and are relatively cheap once the player's force pool and regeneration are high enough. Because there are few meaningful drawbacks to repeated use, combat quickly devolves into spamming the same ability until everything is dead or incapacitated. The core issue is not that these powers are strong, but that the game rarely asks the player to make a decision about when or why to use them. Force Wave, for example, is effective against groups, interrupts enemies, and provides crowd control with almost no situational requirement. Once acquired, it solves most encounters regardless of enemy type or environment. When one ability works everywhere, tactical choice disappears. This also ties directly into over-automation and weak tactical expression. Because force powers resolve instantly and reliably, the player is incentivized to press the same button rather than adapt to changing conditions. The game doesn't meaningfully punish poor timing, positioning, or overuse. There is no escalating cost, diminishing return, or contextual resistance that would encourage restraint or planning. Simply speaking, power replaces judgment. A better approach would not be to simply nerf Force Wave, but to give it contextual weight. High-tier force powers should feel like decisive tools, not default actions. This could be achieved by adding cooldowns, escalating force costs, or temporarily strain effects that discourage repeated use. Alternatively, enemies could develop short-term resistance after being affected, forcing the player to rotate abilities instead of relying on a single solution. Another important fix would be shifting force powers away from pure damage and control spam towards battlefield manipulation. Force Wave could be strongest when used to break formations, push enemies into hazards, or create openings for companions rather than serving as a universal knockdown. In that model, using Force Wave repeatedly without purpose would be inefficient, while using it at the right moment would feel smart and impactful. Ultimately, force powers in KOTOR don't fail because they are overpowered, they fail because the system doesn't ask enough of the player. When mastery is expressed through repetition instead of timing and intent, combat loses tension. Making force powers situational, reactive, and costly in the right ways would preserve their fantasy while restoring tactical depth. We also have force powers that are used to buff stuff, like Force Valor, Force Speed, for example. Well, in KOTOR games, you would have to continuously cast them in order to keep the buffs they provide. Initially, it's not bad, but after a while, it becomes a bit annoying. An aura-based approach would fundamentally change how these powers function. Instead of repeatedly casting Force Valor, the player would activate it once, turning it into a sustained force state that continuously affects the party within a certain radius. The cost would not be paid upfront through constant recasting, but through a reduction of the player's maximum force pool as long as the aura remains active. This immediately transforms the power from a free buff into a strategic trade-off. By reducing the maximum force pool, the player is focused to think ahead. Maintaining Force Valor, for example, would mean fewer resources available for offensive or cooldown control powers. The player must now decide whether the current encounter benefits from more sustained team buffs or from access to high-impact abilities. This creates tension and choice where none previously existed. The system also improves feedback and clarity. An active aura is visible, persistent, and easy to understand. The player knows the buff is on, sees its range, and understands its ongoing cost. There is no ambiguity about whether the buff is active or whether it needs to be reapplied. The act of maintaining the aura becomes a conscious tactical stance rather than a repetitive action. More importantly, this approach restores tactical expression. Different aura choices would shape how a fight is approached. Running Force Valor might favor coordinated party combat and longer engagements, while disabling it could signal a shift towards burst damage or control-heavy play. The player is no longer rewarded for mechanical upkeep, but for choosing the right state at the right time. In this model, force powers stop becoming disposable buttons and start behaving like commitments. Jedi Mastery is expressed not through how often a power is cast, but through how well the player manages to sustain influence versus momentary power. That fits both the mechanical needs of KOTOR's combat and the thematic weight of the Force far better than the current system. Both KOTOR games had classes, particularly in KOTOR 2 where it got expanded by adding prestige classes. I wouldn't mind seeing this in KOTOR. Classes are the natural place to gate Force power usage, prevent spam, and encourage tactical commitment. For example, a consular-style class could excel at sustained auras and battlefield control, but struggle with burst damage due to a reduced effective Force pool. A Guardian-type class could focus on momentary, high-impact abilities, but lack access to power-long duration buffs. Suddenly, Force wave span isn't a universal solution. It becomes a playstyle choice with trade-offs. Classes could also fix over-automation by giving the player clearer intent. When your class defines how you're supposed to engage with combat, the game can design encounters that test that identity. A Watchman-type character, for example, might thrive on positioning, debuffs, and attrition, while Weapons Master class rewards precise timing and aggressive play. Combat becomes about expressing your role, not just executing a generic ability rotation. From a tactical standpoint, classes give structure to decision-making. Instead of every Jedi having access to every optimal tool, the player must solve encounters using the strengths and weaknesses of their chosen path. This naturally increases variety, replayability, and mastery. It also allows the designers to make Force powers more situational without frustrating the player, because each class has a clear answer to specific combat problems. To me, it's rather obvious that this fits in the Star Wars theme perfectly. The Force is not meant to be a flat power set where everyone converges on the same optimal build. Different philosophies, disciplines, and training should result in different combat behaviors. KOTOR 2 understood this better than most Star Wars games, and Fate of the Old Republic has the opportunity to modernize that idea rather than abandon it. However, there might be another way of doing the classes. I mean, we have predefined classes, sure, but a fully custom class would also be a thing, particularly for a second playthrough, where you understand how the game operates. For example, with my custom class, I would very much like to invest into computer skills and repair as a Jedi Guardian instead of, let's say, treat injury and demolition. It would be epic and the combinations would be stunning. You would still have defined roles in terms of what you do in combat and in tactical sense of things, but your choice of skills would be a bit different and you could do other stuff, which would mean that you are not fully locked into the role of a certain class, but rather there is a bit of a wiggle room in the sense of giving the player more freedom how to approach things. But done right, classes won't just define builds, they will define how the player thinks, reacts, and fights. And that's exactly the kind of foundation a true spiritual successor needs. To be honest, when I'm thinking about this particular aspect of gameplay, I have no issues with having the same type of attributes and skills that we had in KOTOR games. They all seem okay. The thing that should be done is to redesign how certain attributes affect stuff. For example, strength, dexterity, endurance, and intelligence are fine, but wisdom and charisma are kinda murky. In KOTOR games, wisdom and charisma are overloaded in different ways that quietly undermines the build diversity and role clarity. Let me explain. So, wisdom governs both force power effectiveness and mental resistance, meaning it directly improves offensive capability while simultaneously strengthening defense against mind-affecting abilities. For any Force-focused character, this makes wisdom essentially mandatory, not because it represents a specific role or playstyle choice, but simply because it does too much. There is no meaningful trade-off involved. A player is never choosing between stronger force power or better mental resilience because the same stat provides both. This creates a classical must-pick scenario where ignoring wisdom actively handicaps a character, especially in the later stages of the game. Charisma, on the other hand, suffered from a similar but arguably more damaging design problem. On the surface, it appears to be a social attribute tied to persuasion and dialogue outcomes. In practice, however, charisma also reduces force power costs and influences party alignment and loyalty. This merges three distinct character fantasies: diplomat, force specialist, and leader into a single stat. As a result, players who want efficient force usage, better dialogue outcomes, or greater control over their companions are all incentivized to invest heavily into charisma. Instead of encouraging specialization, the system rewards stacking the same attribute for multiple, unrelated advantages. The combined effect of these overloaded stats is reduced building diversity. Because wisdom and charisma synergize so well, many optimal builds converge towards high values in both, particularly for Jedi characters. Physical attributes such as strength and dexterity often become secondary considerations, and non-force-oriented playstyles struggle to remain competitive as the game progresses. Rather than supporting clearly defined archetypes, such as a combat-focused guardian or force-centric consular, or a purely diplomatic leader, KOTOR tends to funnel players towards a broadly capable Jedi who excels in nearly every system. This also leads to unclear role separation within the game's role-playing framework. Ideally, a force user, a leader, and a diplomat should be mechanically distinct, each supported by different strengths and trade-offs. However, these boundaries are very blurry. Wisdom combines force potency with mental defense, while charisma blends social influence with force efficiency and party management. The result is a system where socially awkward but powerful Jedi are difficult to create, charismatic non-force leaders lack mechanical depth, and specialized diplomats without strong force abilities feel underdeveloped. The attributes no longer reinforce roleplay, instead they flatten it. For the game like Fate of the Old Republic, repeating this structure would risk recreating the same issue. Overloaded attributes inevitably push players towards optimal, homogeneous builds and weaken long-term replay value. Separating force power, mental resistance, persuasion, and leadership into clearer mechanical roles would restore meaningful choice, strengthen character identity, and allow different playstyles to thrive without one or two stats dominating the entire system. I mean, you can be a Jedi Guardian and very good at persuading, like you can be a Jedi Consular and also good at persuading. The thing is, you need to make persuasion viable for both of classes instead of only one. And that's definitely something that KOTOR should work towards. As far as skills go, if KOTOR inherits KOTOR's skill structure without revision, it risks repeating the same imbalance, which is having a small cluster of dominant skills, having several irrelevant ones, and having a couple of them with minimal impact. Skills should define how a character approaches problems, not merely offer optional flavor text. Stronger systemic integration where skills influence combat options, exploration paths, and narrative consequences would restore their purpose and reinforce distinct playstyles. For example, repair and computer use are the clearest examples of must-invest skills. Repair gates major content, including companion backstories, unique upgrades, and optimal quest resolutions, while computer use provides consistent advantages in security-heavy areas through terminals, turrets, and environmental controls. Because these skills unlock tangible gameplay benefits rather than just alternate dialogue, players are strongly incentivized to invest into them regardless of character concept. The same issue is present in Outer Worlds 2, where you are simply forced to pick stuff like hacking and lockpicking because by not picking these skills, you are limiting your own interactivity with the world. Now, I don't mind adding new skills or keeping the current ones, but it's evident stuff needs to be redesigned. Even if the system is completely different, it shouldn't be the way I described it. Every skill should have proper utility, but more importantly, skills should complement your playstyle without developing a feeling you're missing out on stuff just because you didn't pick a proper skill. Feats are not that bad, but sometimes some of them become either mandatory picks or passive number boosts rather than meaningful expressions of playstyle. As an example, combat styles such as Flurry, Power Attack, and Critical Strike are intended to support different approaches, yet in practice, they often converge on similar outcomes: higher damage per round without changing player behavior. The only difference might be the animation each skill has. For Fate of the Old Republic, Feats should emphasize distinct combat identities, introduce new mechanics rather than passive bonuses, and interact directly with skills, attributes, and enemy behavior. Without that evolution, feats will continue to serve as optimization tools instead of expressions of character intent. Alongside with combat, I reckon itemization is pretty important in any RPG. So let's talk about it. Okay, so first thing that I would like to say is that loot should never punish curiosity. Yet in KOTOR, level-based container scaling teaches players to delay opening boxes and avoid exploration. I knew of this, but I have never done it because for me this is completely dumb, so I always opened everything, cleared the area and then moved forward. But still, if I was a bit more tactical, maybe I would get better rewards, but again, it doesn't seem right thing to do. One way to fix this is to lock loot tiers when an area is entered, based on a mix of area difficulty and a broad player level band. This preserves progression and randomness while eliminating metagaming and ensuring that opening a container immediately is always the correct and satisfying choice. I get we are talking about the game that was released in 2003 and 2004, but better safe than sorry. I don't like backtracking unless it gives some kind of a meaningful payout. Sure, have a door or container locked because my skill level isn't high enough to access it, but then I wanna see that my waiting time and my skill growth has been properly rewarded. Unique items must regain their sense of, I suppose, uniqueness. Rather than being statistically superior templates, named and story-related gear should feature bespoke, non-replicable perks that define playstyle instead of raw damage output. Effects like converting critical hits into force regeneration or altering the behavior of specific abilities would be unavailable throughout crafting. The goal is for players to remember why an item matters, not just how high its numbers are. On top of that, unique items can be available super early in the game, but then you introduce a way that the item either levels with you or you upgrade it along the way to unlock its full potential while still having an already defined utility. Let's say I find a Vambrace from this legendary force user. Sure, at level 1 it should give me something like small force point regeneration and +1 to all force powers. But as the time passes and my character level is getting higher, by upgrading it or meditating on it or whatever, the unique legendary trait of the item also increases in power. This might be a problem where you are stuck with one item almost your whole playthrough, and I recognize that. But the thing is, if the item is worth it, I don't mind sticking with it. Maybe along the way you find another one that has more points to force powers, but less to force point regeneration. Whatever may be the case, unique items should feel unique and not something that you toss aside because you found something better by 2% stat margin. Lightsaber crystals also require a clearer philosophical separation. Color crystals should primarily express alignment and narrative identity, focusing on flavor and thematic bonuses. Focusing crystals, on the other hand, should define playstyle, while power crystals provide raw offensive strategy. Only one crystal per lightsaber should be allowed to scale with level, preventing the stacking of multiple scaling effects that currently trivialize combat. This forces meaningful choices rather than automatic optimization. Force powers and gear must be brought back into balance with each other. High-end equipment should introduce trade-offs, such as increased force costs or slower regeneration, while heavy force investment should reduce maximum armor effectiveness. Instead of enabling godlike builds, the system should create friction that encourages specialization and commitment to an archetype, whether that is a force-focused caster, a melee combatant, or a hybrid. Armor also needs a renewed identity. Robes currently dominate because they offer power without compromise, while armor feels like a self-imposed handicap. Armor should grant exclusive defensive benefits, resistances, or tactical perks, while still allowing limited force usage, scaled by armor weight. Heavy armor would emphasize durability at the cost of force efficiency, while light armor would enable partial force access with enhanced survivability. This restores armor as a viable and interesting choice rather than a trap. I would very much like to see something like light Jedi robes and heavy Jedi robes, for example. I mean, what can I say? I have a weakness for Jedi robes, but I want more armor on them. One good example is the Hypercloth Force Expert from Star Wars The Old Republic, where you can see how Jedi robes and heavy armor blend together really nicely to form this amazing armor set. On top of that, customizing heavy armor by just adding a simple Jedi robes and a hood over them would make it epic. Trust me, it cannot fail. Item progression should be more tightly tied to narrative milestones. Major story arcs and alignment-defining decisions should unlock new upgrade tiers, unique items, or special modification paths rather than relying on level alone. Power gained through story reinforces the game's themes and ensures that character growth feels earned through choices and consequences, not just system mastery. Finally, the system must communicate its depth clearly. Players should be able to preview upgrade outcomes, understand alignment scaling, see items upgrade ceiling, and immediately recognize unique perks. Depth without clarity alienates new players while empowering veterans to break the game. Transparent systems invite experimentation without exploitation. Also, before I forget, one very important thing I would like to add before I'm done with this. Do not give us really cool weapons and armors or any kind of item at the end of the game. I can't really stress out how much I dislike it. It always reminds me how in Witcher 3 in Heart of Stone expansion, the best silver sword in the game could only be obtained at the very end of the game. And then I had to wait until next expansion to actually use the damn thing. Don't do that. I would rather find a legendary weapon in the very beginning of the game and slowly upgrade it so I can reach its maximal potential instead of just flat out locking it out without giving me a proper go with it. Just don't. That's the worst thing that can happen. I love crafting, especially when I can make all kinds of new weapons and upgrades. Considering KOTOR 1 didn't do that good of a job when it comes to crafting, let's focus on what we can find in the second game. So, right from the start, crafting and item upgrades give better control over builds and make skills more relevant. The system ties directly into skills like repair and demolition, meaning your choices in character building actually impact your effectiveness with items and upgrades. You could say crafting makes the game feel more engaging because you can create your own powerful weapons, not just rely on loot drops. It's 100% better than in KOTOR 1. Crafting is essential if you want to play something like a gunslinger or blaster-focused character, since high-level guns and mods often aren't readily found, and crafting lets you equip gear that keeps those builds competitive. Thing is, if I'm playing as a Jedi, which most of the time I am, there aren't a lot of situations where you are maining a gunslinger character. That being said, I wouldn't say no to creating a very decent weapon to my range guys, particularly Canderous. Problem is, you have to track down schematics and components or chemicals, depending what you're making. That can sometimes feel like it interrupts pacing or forces you to engage with crafting even if you don't enjoy that kind of mechanic. Grinding for components might also be an issue. Add to the problem of breaking down items into a single component, regardless of their original value, and you are being placed in a situation where you can only upgrade a handful of characters while the rest get whatever is left as a spare equipment. This feels inefficient, and then what I call the materials economy comes into way, and it can be a pain to balance compared to the benefit of crafted items. Another problem is crafting eventually becomes super powerful. If you have access to good schematics or materials, crafting can lead to overpowered weapons and armor that trivialize combat. Enemies become all but irrelevant late game. I mean, I was plowing through them with great ease. You don't really care about anything, you just want to see big numbers. That doesn't mean I don't want to be powerful, but not to a point where tactics don't really matter anymore. Finally, I don't think there are enough visual indicators something was changed. What I mean by this is when you upgrade an item, say a vibroblade with ionite edge for example, you don't really notice it on the weapon model. What KOTOR 2 did with armor and weapon customization in terms of adding upgrade is really good. It just lacks more stuff on the visual side. So obviously from what I have said here in KOTOR, crafting should avoid all these issues and introduce what's missing. Crafting should be more about giving you functionality rather than giving you raw power. I mean, power is nice, don't get me wrong, but then it just ignores other aspects of the game. For example, I love how I can customize my lightsaber to be more deflection orientated by adding a specific emitter that gives me +4 to deflect. That kinda specializes you for a specific role, but also emphasizes on your lightsaber form technique if you went with Soresu, for example. From what I have seen in the trailer for KOTOR, there is going to be some kind of a vessel that's going to be a mobile base. Or maybe we will have a base of its own. The ship is just going to serve as a means of transportation from one location to the other. For the purposes of video, let's assume it's going to be something like Ebon Hawk. What I would like to see is more interactivity with the ship. Basically something like Normandy from Mass Effect trilogy. I want to see myself navigating the galaxy through the galaxy map, traveling between star systems, select planets and landing zones, and initiate both main and side missions. The ship should serve as a central point for mission management, allowing the player to receive briefings, track objectives, and decide the overall flow of the story. While aboard, the player can manage the squad by selecting companions for upcoming missions, speak with crew members, unlocking personal quests, and advancing relationship-driven dialogue. What would also be cool is making companions react to you when you are close to them. For example, when you get near them, if they have something to say, they would say stuff like, "Hey, let's talk," or "Could you come over here a bit?" And then you initiate the dialogue sequence. When they have nothing to say, and you approach them in intention to speak, they might react with something like "nothing new" or "some other time." It all depends what kind of personality they have, and that should reflect their response. In addition, the ship should function as a narrative hub where codex entries are unlocked, story cutscenes are triggered, and major plot events unfold, making the ship not just as a means of transportation, but the core system through which exploration, preparation, and story progressions are tied together. Now, I know the title of this section is Ship and Ship Combat, and you guessed it, now it's time to talk about ship combat. But to be honest, I don't know if adding ship combat is a good or a bad thing. In previous games, these battles were basically turret sections. They were not bad, but if you have seen one, you have seen all of them. In Star Wars The Old Republic, ship combat was kinda okay, but it's your classical on-rails shooter. Naturally, if we are going to talk more in depth about this, it goes without saying ships should have upgrades and all that good stuff. But to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if ship combat isn't a thing in KOTOR. However, if it would be a thing, my reaction would mostly be like, unexpected surprise to be sure, but a welcomed one. You could look at it like minigame or some quasi-card game thing like Gwent in The Witcher 3. Still, I think it's highly unlikely we're gonna see any type of active ship combat. Maybe through cutscenes where everything is already pre-made, so to speak, so we are just an observer, but that's about it. That's the max I could expect. It's pretty much obvious this game is going to have companions. What are they going to be like? I honestly don't care. I'm mostly interested about gameplay here, particularly in tactical sense. However, I will touch a bit on other aspects as well. So, in my mind, first thing companions need to have is good AI in order for them to function properly. Like I have discussed previously in the combat section, if they are ranged companions, they should search for cover, avoid melee confrontation, all that good stuff. If we put verticality into place, it would be cool if they search for high ground in order to exploit it in the best possible way. In KOTOR, as it is well known, the best thing they can do, if they were ranged, when they were attacked by melee characters, was to switch to melee weapon and then use it to do whatever is they are trying to do. I will never forget this mission in KOTOR 2, where you play as Aten and you are doing that stuff on Nar Shaddaa, where he is being ambushed by twin Twi'leks at the Pazak Den. Obviously, leveling him as a gunslinger was a mistake, but I didn't know better since it was my first time playing the game. So naturally, for my next playthrough, I made him a full-time melee practitioner. But yeah, this situation tells you a lot about ranged character capabilities. Melee classes, on the other hand, should go for squishier targets if we are talking about assassin-type characters, which means more flanking, while tankier ones should try to draw fire on themselves in order to protect the ones who cannot. It's pretty much the reasonable thing to do when it comes to tactics. That is, until you order them otherwise. Which brings me to the next point. Companions in KOTOR games were lackluster in combat department because you couldn't really program them in a meaningful way. One good example of a system that is really good is the one from Dragon Age Origins. You could define what they would do, when, and how. This level of customization of tactical control was amazing, and I think it's the way to go in KOTOR. Sure, you could have pre-made templates of certain behaviors, but I always found those to be very limiting. I mean, it can be done, but why not let us, the players, do something about that? I always remember how I was setting up things in Dragon Age Origins and all my companions were performing so good. I was actually very proud of myself, as well as satisfied with the system that was in place. Another thing, what I would like to see with companions, is them retaining their signature gear. See, I'm all up for dressing them up and giving them items and all that, but the problem is, they lose their identity. In KOTOR, Mission WoW has this cool looking outfit that really defines who she is. And what do you do with it? You toss it aside immediately when you find something with better defense bonuses if you are going to use her as one of your companions. And then what happens next is all your companions that can use light armor pretty much look the same, apart obviously from their face. So what can you do about that? In my mind, you keep their visual identity fixed, but then you introduce upgrade options for their gear. Something like that we can see in Outer Worlds too, but in that game the upgrade options are very poor. So you add up more stuff to upgrade and more upgrade opportunities. For example, in the KOTOR games, characters have body and hand slots. Well, in that case, you can assign, let's say, 4 upgrade slots for the body and 2 for the hands. That way you can still heavily modify their gear and stats, making it interesting to experiment with their builds, provided they will have the same skills, power and feat screen like in KOTOR games. Then again, I can recognize that some people like to dress up their companions like there's no tomorrow. One game that comes to mind is Baldur's Gate 3. There you can do whatever you want, changing their visual identity on the fly. I mean, that is also an acceptable thing, provided the armors that you put on characters correspond with their class and the way that they behave. Maybe there might be a system whereby you can upgrade all the gear in the world on them, but they have an overall skin or outfit that can be turned on and off. That way you can satisfy both the ones who like changing the looks and the ones who want the looks to be the same, regardless of the gear they have on them. To be honest, now that I think about it, as long as the gear you are putting on the companions reflects their personality and combat styles, like I said before, it's not a big of a problem. I mean, let's be honest, both KOTOR games were very basic in that sense, so I might be a bit traumatized from that particular experience. Now, Mass Effect 3 did stuff with companions where it completely ignored any gear upgrades. That wasn't a thing for them, it was only important for Shepard. As far as I'm concerned, that does solve problems with their looks and gear, but it leaves less space to give them proper upgrades in that aspect. They had their class upgrades, and you could somewhat influence health, shield, power and weapon damage, and then you got some squad bonuses too. Maybe the same thing can be done here, but with a bit of more upgrades, like it was in Mass Effect 1. For example, you keep the visual identity of the companions like in Mass Effect 3, but you give them talents like in Mass Effect 1. As far as weapons go, they can have their signature weapon, and with that you can boost damage, reload speed, maybe give them option for different damage type like sonic or ion or whatever, and then different fire mode and all that good stuff. So, for example, we have a bounty hunter character. Main class for that character would obviously be bounty hunter. Then we have talents like darts, which then can be branched to different darts, like electric dart, paralyzing dart. Then we have jetpack, gadgets, you know, stuff that a bounty hunter uses. Then you upgrade shield, armor, stamina, whatever may be the case. Next thing would be a weapon, let's say a blaster, that can be upgraded in terms of fire rate, reload, damage type, maybe special firing mode. Maybe you can even modify barrel, power cell, something along the lines what we had with Workbench in Knights of the Old Republic 2. And that's about it. Another thing that I'm thinking about is the hide/show helmet or headgear option. On the other hand, if the weather is a bit hostile, like a desert storm or an ice planet, then sure, keep the helmet or some goggles or whatever. But during cutscenes while indoors or on the ship, I wouldn't mind seeing their faces. Unless it's some kind of a Mandalorian character where they don't want to remove the helmet or something like that. On the other hand, I always hated gear in KOTOR like sonic nullifiers, where it was covering half of my face and I couldn't hide it. So my next best thing was to put something on their head that was visually acceptable, like the neural band or meditation band, just so I can see their face. Or worst case scenario, I put nothing, which is bad since I'm not utilizing that particular gear slot. I think it's pretty much evident what kind of quests I would like to see in KOTOR. To be pretty blunt, whatever Witcher 3 or Cyberpunk was doing, that's basically the way to go. Other than these two examples, there are other games that have really good quest design, like Baldur's Gate 3, Fallout New Vegas, Mass Effect 2, new Deus Ex games, stuff like that. Here is one example that I conjured myself in order to showcase what I really want. So picture a scene. You are walking down the street and you see this guy being put to sleep, if you know what I mean, by this guy in black armor. We try to do something, but we are too late. The armored figure already eliminated his target, and as he is about to leave the scene, we confront him. Our protagonist throws the lightsaber at this mysterious person, aiming for his jetpack, but the mysterious man deflects it, says something along the lines of "Nice try, Jedi," and then flies away. Upon further investigation, we figure out he went directly into the sewage system, where eventually we lose him. There is no point going after him because the sewers are a maze, so we abandon the chase, but only before we find out more about our mysterious man. While visiting a local cantina on that planet, our protagonist will find out about a vigilante who is unliving a specific group of people, in this case corrupt law enforcers and officials. Also, considering I'm going to be using the word vigilante a lot, let's just call him Bob. It's much easier. Well, turns out Bob is pretty popular. The common people love him because finally someone is doing something to eradicate these bad people. On the other hand, law enforcement isn't that happy because it undermines their authority, and our boy Bob is making them look bad. I mean, not everybody there is a crook. So pretty much right from the start you can make a choice who to support, but it's still wise to do some digging and get more info about the matter. Now, you can go and do some investigation in order to understand Bob's motives, do some evidence collecting, you can even talk to the people to figure stuff out. Maybe you can come to conclusion Bob is actually very right to do so. Or you can simply be like, okay, law enforcement wants Bob gone, it's time to do something about that. Or you just go straight into sewers to find out where the hell Bob is hiding. Or there is another option. You find out info you haven't covered, which isn't as clear to define who is in the right here. It's all one big mess and you don't really know anymore what the right choice is. Eventually, the quest will push you in a direction where you find Bob's lair. Obviously, you gotta fight a lot of droids and turrets in order to get to Bob. He is not making it easy on us. But if you were diligent enough, you might find a secret entrance to his base. Whatever might be the case, at the end, you will find Bob and engage into conversation. Or maybe you won't. You really don't care, you just want to nab Bob and be done with it. However, if you decide to talk to him, you will be able to get some backstory, reasons why our mate Bob is doing these things, all that good stuff. You might even challenge his views, maybe provide evidence he isn't fully in the right. Now, we can branch again in this particular quest. You can persuade Bob to stop doing his shenanigans and start working with the law enforcement people. That's all cool, but there are some corrupt individuals there and you gotta weed these people out in order to convince Bob to do your thing. You can either eliminate them for dark side points, for example, or you can find evidence against them for light side points and put them in jail. Now, if you manage to persuade Bob and you get rid of these corrupt people, all is well. You get light side points, the quest is done, everybody is alive and well. Awesome happy ending. Or you can say that whatever Bob is doing is wrong because being judge, jury and executioner is not the way to go. Back when you were kinda collecting evidence and more information about Bob and his actions, you stumbled upon some evidence that Bob unalived some people who weren't guilty. And if you didn't persuade Bob to stand down, you will have to fight. After a long battle, our protagonist manages to defeat Bob. Now the player will have the following choice. You can eliminate Bob for dark side points, or you can apprehend him for light side points. Neutral characters will have the opportunity to leave Bob alone, telling him to stop his activities at once. Now, whether or not you antagonize Bob during the conversation, after you turn your back to him, he might go into rage mode and try to shoot you in the back if you spared him. In that sense, you will have to unalive him, but that won't award any dark or light side points because it's considered self-defense. If the conversation went well, Bob will stop doing the vigilante stuff. Now, if you haven't noticed, what I'm trying to showcase here is all the choices you can make and all the outcomes you can have. You can either help Bob by eliminating or apprehending the corrupt individuals, and you offer him to work as a law enforcer. You make Bob stop doing stuff by defeating him, and then based on the conversation you had prior, you end up eliminating him or he just gives up. Or you don't really care, you just end him or capture him, no questions asked. And finally, when you end him, you can get rid of the people he had on his hit list for more dark side points. The choices you make should be based on the story itself. Yes, people like Bob, but Bob might be killing his targets in a very ugly manner. So one might say, yes, Bob is nice and fine, but the way he's doing stuff is wrong. The goal here is to make it hard to decide what to do with our boy Bob because he ain't making it easy for us. These types of quests are exactly what makes RPGs great because there is moral ambiguity and it can't be easily dispelled, and you just gotta make the choice and live with it. Whatever you do with Bob, you need to feel like both decisions are justifiable, but it should bother you in a sense if you made the right decision or not. At least that's how I feel and how I justify my decisions when I have a quest like that in front of me. One important thing here is that the quest should reward you the same amount XP no matter which route you take. The reason I'm saying this is ultimately, if you have an XP system, you wanna pick a choice that gives you the most XP or rewards for that matter. When the XP and the loot gain is the same, no matter what, that allows you to make decisions based on your own desires without being influenced by potential reward gains. Not to mention, it facilitates replayability, which is an amazing thing for every RPG. So pretty much these types of quests are the way to go as far as I'm concerned. The games I mentioned before kinda spoiled me, but in a good way, and I want to see quests with complexity, branching paths and moral ambiguity because making decisions in RPG is what the genre is all about. Alignment system or morality system is something every RPG game should have. That's my honest conviction. Looking at the morality system in KOTOR games, the plan is to expand said system in KOTOR and add a couple of new features. With the usual dark side and light side choices, I think KOTOR would benefit from adding another view on the Force. In gameplay terms, this means our protagonist will be able to follow the neutral way of the Force, excluding himself or herself from both dark and the light side. When I say excluding, I really mean not going into one extreme or the other, but keeping a neutral stance, basically not meddling in anything, just doing your own thing. I mean, world doesn't operate in black and white terms, but shades of grey, and that's where grey Jedi philosophy can be introduced. Being a grey Jedi means to be a Force user who walks the line between the light and the dark side, without surrendering to the dark side, but also not being the ultimate paragon of the light. The additional third morality option means the players will have more options in dialogue and more decisions to make, and finally they will have the opportunity to follow a different path without fearing they could lose attribute points when they reach the peak of their morality alignment. That was the thing in KOTOR 2. You could get bonuses only if you were pure dark or pure light side character, so you had to take all the choices that keep you in that extreme, even though sometimes, as far as I'm concerned, a dark side option was more appropriate to choose if you were a light side character. Not to mention, there were plenty of opportunities to stay neutral, as far as I'm concerned, but somehow you were always shoehorned into one of the extremes because there was no reward to stay in the middle. You will still be encouraged to stick with your morality choices of your choosing, and the more time you spend aligned with the morality of your choosing, the harder it will be for you to switch to another morality option. This will be enabled by choosing certain passive bonuses, which will be unlocked with talent tree system when you reach a certain threshold. For example, when you get to 75% of light or dark side, that talent tree opens up and then you can put points inside and do whatever you want. These points will be mostly passive abilities to choose from. And essentially they will enable you to gain more alignment points for the chosen morality, decrease the gains of another alignment, or to simply increase attribute points. If, however, you want to stick to the neutral side of things, after spending certain time in the middle, so to speak, the talent tree will open up as well. The cool thing about this is that you can go from neutral to light or dark side, but if you stay longer than you should in the middle, eventually there won't be any chance to do so, especially once you commit to your desired alignment. With the addition of alignment talent tree and its passive abilities, the neutral characters will have more freedom with their choices without risking an alignment change. Naturally, if the quests are not structured in that way that facilitates the neutral path, that means this thing won't be a possibility, but here's me hoping that it will be like this. Having a morality system always means more replayability. As far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't mind playing the game simply based on my own morality, for the first time anyway, but for the second time I would plan a bit more which kind of alignment I will pick, or perhaps just stay in the middle. I mean, binary morality system is always a thing, no matter which game you are thinking about, like for example Mass Effect or Fallout New Vegas, so why not have a third option? I don't know a lot of games that are doing this, so might as well having KOTOR being the first game to adopt this approach, and then who knows, maybe it will pick up for the next game, I don't know. I'd like to see several things that can further enhance gameplay. For example, dialogue should be grayed out once you have exhausted all the categories within chosen dialogue branch. We should be able to change color of our armor. If there will be a system that uses adrenals, it should be either long-lasting or be used automatically through some sort of inbuilt implant or something along the lines. Finally, I'm for the silent protagonist option, but Mass Effect 3 did a good job with the voiced one, so I don't know. Anyway, there is not a lot of stuff in the honorable mention selection, but if I missed something or there is a category that I didn't mention, please write it in the comments and then we'll see what happens. It's fair to say that I covered a lot of things in this video. To be honest, it wasn't that hard for me because KOTOR games were always my passion and I love them and I enjoyed playing them so many times. I don't think I can put the number of full playthroughs I had. Yes, even back in the day I was fully aware of the issues the games have, but you gotta understand, things were different back then and KOTOR games at that time were considered peak RPG games with amazing gameplay mechanics. Even KOTOR 2, which wasn't finished properly, was still a killer game. But today, the tech has advanced so much and stuff has evolved to the point where I can say with decent confidence it can support, or rather it can help become reality for most, if not all of my ideas and suggestions. The effort can be made to elevate the spirit of KOTOR games through KOTOR. Fate of the Old Republic is not a direct sequel or continuation of KOTOR stories, which is true, but I'd argue it's a spiritual successor. I mean, it's in the name, the Old Republic. To me, it's more than enough to make this conclusion. Not to mention, as it was said in the article on the Star Wars official website, it is being built by people who helped shape the legacy. They 100% understand what that legacy means. Or at least I hope they do. Naturally, everything here is based on the previous KOTOR games, and KOTOR here is a vessel that can encompass all these ideas and suggestions. I really believe this is the case. Even if I didn't take KOTOR games as a base, I think the same conclusions would have been made, and that's a good thing. Because if someone who never played KOTOR games starts thinking about this, I wouldn't be surprised if the ideas are, if not the same, then very similar. The purpose of this video is to start some kind of a discussion or conversation about this game, flesh out ideas, and make them known to general public. And maybe devs might look into this and say something along the lines like, you know, this isn't such a bad idea. Also, I know development process is complicated and certain things might be hard to pull out, but the game is still in early development, so who knows, maybe my blabbering could do something to influence that. Whatever may be the case, from my point of view, I always wanted to publish something like this, and now I had the opportunity and I did it. And I feel at peace now because I did what feels right. That's more than enough for me. If you managed to get to the end of this thing, well, thank you so much for listening. Write down in the comment section if you agree with me or if you disagree with my suggestions and observations. I am really curious what you guys have to say about all this. Do you think my ideas are good or maybe bad? Do you have other ideas that I didn't cover? The comment section is there for a reason, and I read all the comments, so I'm looking forward interacting with you all. Also, like the video if you find it to be good, share it if you want other people to see it, and sub to the channel if stuff that I'm making vibes with you. And that's it from me, until the next one.